Get out now! My HOA president screamed this at me in front of the entire neighborhood. But here's what didn't make sense. My house isn't even in her HOA. Why would she care about a property she had zero control over? I thought I was dealing with a power-hungry neighbor. Dead wrong. This woman was running something much darker, and when I started digging, I discovered she'd been targeting my family in ways I never imagined. What she did to my wife while I was at work will haunt me forever. The night I confronted her with evidence, she snapped and revealed everything. You won't believe how far she'd gone. Moving to Maplewood subdivision was supposed to be our fresh start. I'm Marcus, a 38-year-old HVAC technician, and my wife Beth is a nurse at the local hospital. After years of dealing with overly restrictive HOA rules at our previous place, we specifically chose this house because it sat just outside the Maplewood Homeowners Association boundaries. Freedom at last, or so we thought. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had spent my whole career fixing things that were broken, but I had no idea I was about to encounter something that couldn't be fixed. A neighbor who would make our lives a living nightmare. Our new house was perfect. A modest 2-story with a decent yard, a reasonable mortgage, and most importantly, no monthly HOA fees breathing down our necks. What could possibly go wrong with that setup? The first red flag should have been how quickly she appeared. We'd barely gotten the moving truck unloaded when this woman materialized at our front door like she'd been watching from her window, waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. She was dressed like the ultimate suburban mom, designer athleisure wear, perfectly styled blonde hair, and a smile that could have sold 1,000 magazine subscriptions. In her manicured hands, she carried a plate of what looked like homemade chocolate chip cookies, still warm and smelling incredible. Welcome to Maplewood. I'm Karen, the HOA president. We take care of all residents here. It's what makes our community so special. The way she emphasized all should have been my second warning, but honestly, after months of house hunting stress, having a friendly neighbor bearing cookies felt like a good sign. I made the mistake that would change everything when I casually mentioned, actually, our house is outside the HOA jurisdiction. That's one of the reasons we chose it. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Karen's smile froze for just a split second, and I caught a micro expression of pure rage flash across her face before the practiced pleasantness returned. Outside? That can't be right. Every house in Maplewood follows our community standards. Every single one. The way she said it wasn't questioning. It was like she was correcting a fundamental error in the universe itself. Looking back now, I should have recognized that tone for what it was. The sound of someone whose carefully constructed world had just developed a crack and who would do absolutely anything to repair it. What followed was the most intense interrogation, disguised as a friendly conversation I'd ever experienced. Karen spent the next 40 minutes grilling me about deed details, survey boundaries, previous owners, our income, job stability, family background, and even our long-term neighborhood plans. This wasn't normal neighbor curiosity. This was systematic intelligence gathering, conducted with military precision. She asked about our mortgage terms, whether we had children, what our work schedules looked like, and even probed about any family disputes or financial difficulties we might have experienced. Every question was wrapped in sugary concern, but I could feel the calculation behind those bright eyes as she filed away every piece of information I gave her. The psychological manipulation started immediately. Karen launched into this whole spiel about how she'd spent 5 years creating the perfect community, where every detail was managed and every resident coordinated. She talked about property values, neighborhood harmony, and community standards like she was describing a religious mission rather than suburban governance. Your house being separate, it disrupts our harmony, she said, her voice taking on this dreamy, almost fanatical quality. Then came the hook. Regardless of what paperwork says, you're part of our community now. We protect our own here. The way she said protect made it sound more like a threat than a promise, but I was too tired from moving to fully process the implications. As our conversation continued, I noticed Karen had this habit of wandering around our front porch, ostensibly admiring our lovely landscaping, but actually conducting what I now realize was a security assessment. She tested our door handle under the guise of steadying herself, peered through windows while commenting on our beautiful interior, and spent an unusual amount of time near our outdoor electrical meter, claiming she was just checking to make sure everything looked properly installed. At the time, I thought she was being thorough in a helpful, if slightly intrusive way. Later, I'd understand those little checks weren't small talk. They were a quiet inventory of our vulnerabilities. The whole interaction felt surreal, like being welcomed by someone who simultaneously wanted to be your best friend and your warden. Karen had this uncanny ability to make every comment sound supportive while carrying an underlying current of control. She mentioned how previous residents had faced some challenges when they didn't fully embrace community integration, but always with this concerned, protective tone that made it sound like she was trying to help us avoid their mistakes. By the time she finally left, promising to check in soon and make sure we were settling in properly, I had this weird feeling that I'd just signed an invisible contract I didn't remember agreeing to. I didn't have paper, but I had terms. She would check in, I would cooperate, and somehow all residents now meant me too. It sounded like hospitality and felt like onboarding. The smile was customer service. The subtext was compliance. I kept replaying her pauses, the way she weighed words like fees on a scale, how we protect our own landed less as comfort and more as policy. It was the kind of kindness that comes with a clipboard. After Karen disappeared back to her house with that practiced smile still plastered on her face, I went to grab our mail from the box we'd just set up. What I found there made my blood run cold. A detailed property survey that I definitely hadn't ordered, showing boundaries that were completely different from what our realtor had shown us. According to this version, our house sat barely inside the HOA limits, contradicting everything in our purchase documents. The survey looked official, complete with professional stamps and measurements, but something about it felt wrong. Who had access to modify official county documents? And more importantly, why would someone go through the trouble to alter them? As I stood there staring at those fabricated boundary lines, I realized that Karen's visit hadn't been a welcome wagon. It had been a reconnaissance mission, and I was now officially on someone's radar who had resources I couldn't even begin to understand. That night, as Beth and I settled into our new home, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every creak, every slow-rolling car, every shadow made me check the locks twice. By morning, fresh scratches ringed our deadbolts, tiny, deliberate, the kind you only see when someone has been practicing on your doors. The next few days should have been about settling into our new routine, but instead, they became a masterclass in psychological pressure tactics. I was still trying to wrap my head around those mysterious lock scratches when our next-door neighbor decided to introduce himself. Tom appeared at my door around 7 in the morning, a friendly-looking guy in his late 50s with graying hair and the kind of confident handshake that screamed, trustworthy, professional. He immediately launched into this whole spiel about being a retired county property assessor who'd lived in the neighborhood for over a decade. As someone who knows property values better than most, I can tell you Karen's absolutely right about the benefits of HOA membership, he said, like we'd been in the middle of a conversation about it. I hadn't mentioned Karen or HOA issues to anyone, which meant either he was psychic or our conversations were being monitored. Tom came prepared with what looked like legitimate professional documentation, spreadsheets, charts, and graphs showing how HOA properties in our area outperformed non-HOA properties by 20 to 25% annually. The data looked impressive, complete with county seal stamps and official letterheads that seemed to validate every number. He pulled out his tablet and showed me comparable sales, market trends, and projected property appreciation rates that made joining the HOA sound like a no-brainer financial decision. Look, I've been assessing properties for 30 years, he said, pointing to a particularly convincing graph. These numbers don't lie. Your house could be worth $40,000 more within 2 years if you join the association and follow their improvement guidelines. Coming from someone with his claimed credentials, the argument was compelling enough to make me second-guess our decision to avoid HOA entanglements. But then Tom made his real pitch. He suggested I refinance our mortgage based on these higher property values, and offered to connect me with a trusted mortgage broker who specialized in HOA community properties. The broker could apparently fast-track our application and get us rates that were significantly better than what non-HOA properties typically qualify for. Something about the whole setup felt too convenient, too perfectly timed, but Tom's professional demeanor made it hard to dismiss outright. He even offered to personally vouch for us in his professional capacity as a former assessor, claiming his recommendation would carry weight with both the lender and the HOA board. The more he talked, the more I realized this wasn't a casual neighborly chat. This was a coordinated sales pitch designed to exploit our financial vulnerabilities. He wasn't selling comfort, he was selling leverage. The association premium appraisal would fluff equity on paper, then the broker would skim quiet costs. I'd only notice months later, discount points, a prepayment snare, a swollen escrow that never flowed back. He framed it as momentum, like the smart move was to sign while boxes were still stacked in the hall. Fatigue signs faster than ink, and he could read it on my face. Meanwhile, Karen had completely abandoned her sweet neighbor act and shifted into full intimidation mode. Gone were the cookies and warm smiles, replaced by daily visits that felt more like inspections than social calls. She'd show up at random times, sometimes when I was leaving for work, sometimes when Beth was coming home from the hospital, always with some new demand about joining the HOA or following community standards that supposedly applied to us despite our legal exemption. "Marcus, you're making this harder than necessary," she'd say, standing uncomfortably close and speaking in this patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. Previous holdouts in this area have faced permit delays, code violations, even police calls about disturbances. Very unfortunate situations that could have been completely avoided with proper community cooperation. The threats became more specific and more frequent. Karen would casually mention how the city building inspector was particularly thorough with properties that didn't maintain community standards, or how the police department took noise complaints very seriously in our neighborhood. She had referenced other families who had supposedly struggled with integration issues until they finally saw the wisdom of joining the association. Every story was designed to plant seeds of fear about what might happen if we continued to resist her demands. The way she delivered these warnings, with fake concern and manufactured sympathy, made them even more chilling than direct threats would have been. I decided to install a basic security camera system to document whatever was happening around our property. The installation process was eye-opening in ways I hadn't expected. While setting up the cameras, I discovered that Tom had apparently been conducting his own surveillance operation. My camera captured him photographing our property deed through our kitchen window late at night, using some kind of long-lens camera setup that suggested this wasn't amateur hour spying. Even more disturbing was the discovery that he somehow had access to our mailbox. Footage showed him opening it with his own key, photographing our mail, and carefully replacing everything so we wouldn't notice it had been disturbed. How the hell does a neighbor get a copy of your mailbox key, and why would he need to read your private correspondence? I dropped a letter to myself with a Tel 1 graphite line under the flap and a tiny swipe of invisible ink on the crease. Inside, I wrote nothing important, just a fake account number and a wrong middle initial I had never used. If it surfaced anywhere, I would see the scar. That night, I filmed the box from the bay window without moving a curtain. A shape passed, not hurried, not afraid. The next afternoon, a courtesy call about the very account number I had invented came from a broker I had never met. The world is loud when someone thinks you are not listening. The pattern of harassment escalated with surgical precision. I started receiving official-looking documents that appeared to be legitimate city violations, citations for lawn height that was supposedly too long, improper mailbox placement that violated municipal codes, and an unauthorized fence that was apparently blocking public easement access. Each violation came with detailed municipal code references, official letterhead, and fine schedules that looked completely legitimate. The documents were intimidating enough that I actually called the city to verify them, which is when I discovered something truly disturbing. According to the clerk I spoke with, these violations had been filed by someone with administrative access to their computer system, someone who knew exactly how to make fake citations look authentic and had the technical ability to enter them into official databases. Whoever did this has insider knowledge of our processes, the city clerk told me, sounding genuinely concerned. These citations were created using valid department codes and supervisor approval numbers, but none of the violations actually exist on your property. Someone with significant system access would need to pull this off. That conversation sent chills down my spine because it meant Karen and Tom weren't just nosy neighbors with too much time on their hands. They had connections within local government that gave them access to official systems and the ability to create convincing fraudulent documents. What kind of network were we dealing with here? The psychological pressure was becoming unbearable. Beth started asking questions about why we were getting so many official letters and whether we'd made a mistake choosing this house. I could see the stress affecting her work performance and our relationship, which I'm sure was exactly what Karen intended. Every day brought some new crisis, a fake violation to dispute, a threatening letter to investigate, or a helpful visit from Tom with more financial pressure disguised as friendly advice. I felt like we were under siege in our own home, constantly having to defend our right to live peacefully in a house we'd legally purchased and properly maintained. The breaking point came when I received what looked like an official notice of code violations that was so detailed and professional looking that I almost fell for it completely. The document cited specific municipal codes, referenced recent city council decisions about property maintenance standards, and included photographic evidence of violations that supposedly required immediate correction or would result in daily fines starting at $50. But when I called the city again to verify this latest batch of citations, the clerk's response made my blood run cold. "Sir, these violations were filed by someone who not only has administrative access to our system, but also knows exactly how to manipulate our database to make false entries appear legitimate. We're going to need to involve our cybersecurity department, because this represents a serious breach of municipal systems." By this point, I knew we needed legal help, but finding the right attorney felt like navigating a minefield. After researching several options, I settled on Lena Carter, a local real estate lawyer with excellent reviews and specific experience handling HOA disputes. Her office was professional, her credentials were impressive, and most importantly, she seemed to understand exactly what we were dealing with from the moment I described our situation. "I see this constantly," she said during our initial consultation, leaning forward with the kind of focused attention that made me feel like she genuinely cared about our case. "Karen's using clearly illegal intimidation tactics combined with document fraud. I'll shut down her harassment immediately with a comprehensive cease and desist order backed by actionable legal threats." Her confidence was exactly what I needed to hear after weeks of feeling helpless against Karen's psychological warfare. Lena's approach seemed methodical and thorough. She requested copies of all the fraudulent violations, documented every instance of harassment, and asked for detailed financial information to build what she called a comprehensive legal strategy. She wanted bank statements, mortgage documents, employment records, and even our personal schedules to demonstrate how the harassment was affecting our daily lives and financial stability. "The more documentation we have, the stronger our case becomes," she explained, making notes in a thick legal pad as she spoke. "I'll need everything to show a pattern of targeted harassment and demonstrate the full scope of damages you've suffered." The process felt invasive, but after dealing with Karen's violations and Tom's surveillance, turning over our private information to a licensed attorney seemed like a necessary step toward reclaiming our lives. Within a week, Lena called with what sounded like fantastic news. "Excellent news! I've reviewed all the city records, and they definitely confirm your deed accuracy. Karen has absolutely no legal authority over your property, and the violations you received were all fraudulent." She'd apparently spent hours at the county courthouse pulling official boundary surveys, deed records, and HOA incorporation documents that proved our house fell completely outside Maplewood's jurisdiction. Not only that, but I've identified several criminal violations in Karen's behavior: harassment, fraud, possibly even stalking charges if we can prove the surveillance Tom's been conducting. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like we might actually have the upper hand in this situation. But Lena's next revelation made me realize our problems were bigger than I'd imagined. "However, I discovered something else while confirming your deed," she said, tone shifting. "A company called Premium Properties has been advising HOAs on land use. On paper, they're angling for an access road near your block. On paper, the signatories and shell LLCs behind them trace back to Karen's donors and two of her board allies." She slid over filings that looked like routine development chatter until you noticed the same three names repeating through purchase options and consulting retainers. "It's not just control," she said, "it's a funnel." A straight line ran through the signatures: a board ally and a community advisory retainer, a shell company that billed for consulting, then a development bid that needed one clean entrance lane. My lot wasn't sentimental, it was geometry. A driveway sketched through our living room. Get me to agree, and the access road turned from dream to blueprint. This new information reframed everything. Maybe Karen wasn't just obsessed with neighborhood control. Maybe she had a financial incentive to get us out of the house. Lena recommended we focus our legal strategy on the developers rather than Karen, arguing that Karen's just a desperate homeowner trying to protect her community from commercial development. It was a compelling theory that explained the professional level of harassment we'd been experiencing and why Karen seemed to have access to official systems and documentation. Lena offered to investigate premium properties acquisition tactics and threatened to expose any illegal methods they might be using to pressure homeowners into selling. I felt hopeful for the first time in weeks, but something nagging me made me decide to do a little independent research on premium properties. What I discovered made my stomach drop. The company's office building was in a part of town I'd driven past hundreds of times, and I realized I could easily verify Lena's claims by taking a quick look at their operations. So, after our meeting, instead of going straight home, I decided to drive by their office to see what kind of development company we were dealing with. What I saw through the ground floor windows made me question everything Lena had told me. There was Lena, sitting at a conference table with Karen, our color-tabbed binders open between them. No negotiation, no confrontation, collaboration. She slid across copies of our bank statements and mortgage file, the very documents I'd handed her to defend us, while Karen joked about the streamlining non-compliant holdouts. It wasn't counsel, it was an intel transfer. The betrayal felt like a physical blow. Our own attorney had been feeding our financial vulnerabilities, legal strategy, and family information directly to the person who had been harassing us for weeks. The scope of the deception was staggering. Lena hadn't been representing our interests at all. She'd been conducting an intelligence gathering operation on Karen's behalf, using her legal credentials to gain access to private information we never would have shared with a stranger. Every strategy discussion, every piece of evidence we'd provided, every legal option we'd considered had been immediately transmitted to our opponent. We hadn't hired an attorney. We'd hired a spy who was working for the other side while charging us for the privilege of being betrayed. I sat in my car outside Premium Properties for almost an hour, trying to process what I'd seen and figure out our next move. Lena and Karen's partnership had been so seamless, so comfortable, that it was obvious they'd worked together many times before. This wasn't a coincidental meeting or a spontaneous collaboration. This was a practiced operation designed to exploit families exactly like ours. How many other people had Lena betrayed? How many other families had trusted her with their private information only to have it used against them by the very people they were trying to fight? When I finally got home, Beth could tell something was wrong, but I didn't know how to explain that our attorney was working for our harasser without sounding completely paranoid. I told her everything in the kitchen with the lights off, like we were hiding from a storm. Beth did not flinch. She put her hand on the folder and said, "No more rooms where we stand alone." We wrote rules on a sticky note and stuck it to the fridge. Never meet without a second witness, record when lawful, send summaries to each other the same night. I typed a revocation letter for Lena, certified mail, and blocked her number before I could second-guess the impulse. It felt like quitting a belief, not just cutting a service, quitting the idea that credentials equal safety. The psychological manipulation had been so expertly executed that I started questioning my own judgment. Had I really seen what I thought I'd seen, or was the stress making me imagine conspiracies where none existed? But the evidence was clear. Our trusted legal representative was actually Karen's business partner, and we'd been paying her to sabotage our own case while collecting intelligence for our opponents. The next day, Lena called to schedule another meeting where Karen would coincidentally be present to discuss a generous compromise offer that would benefit everyone involved. "I've been working behind the scenes to find a resolution that satisfies all parties," Lena explained in her most professional voice. "Karen has agreed to a very fair property swap arrangement where you'd trade your current lot for a superior property plus a substantial cash payment. It's an incredible opportunity that most homeowners would never have access to." The way she presented it made the offer sound like a favor rather than the culmination of a weeks-long psychological warfare campaign designed to force us out of our legally purchased home. But I'd learned enough about their operation to recognize this meeting for what it really was. The end game they'd been working toward from the moment Karen first knocked on our door with those cookies. The property swap, the cash payment, the superior location, it was all designed to sound generous while actually being a sophisticated theft disguised as a business transaction. Lena's legal credentials gave the offer an aura of legitimacy that most people wouldn't question, especially after being worn down by weeks of harassment and fake violations. As I hung up the phone, I overheard Lena telling someone in the background, Once the property transfer is complete, we can begin the Beth removal protocol. The phrase hit me like ice water. What exactly did they plan to do to my wife once they got their hands on our house? The casual way Lena mentioned removal protocol suggested this wasn't just about property acquisition. They had specific plans for dealing with family members who might complicate their scheme. Beth's safety suddenly became a much more immediate concern than property ownership. And I realized we weren't just fighting to keep our house. We were fighting to protect our lives. Have you ever trusted someone who completely betrayed you? Share your story in the comments. I'm reading every single one. The threat to Beth's safety made everything personal in a way that property disputes never could. I started paying closer attention to my wife's behavior and noticed subtle changes that I'd initially attributed to work stress at the hospital. Beth was becoming increasingly irritable over small things, having trouble remembering conversations we'd had just days earlier, and questioning my judgment about the neighborhood conflicts in ways that felt completely out of character for her. She'd always been my strongest supporter, but suddenly she was making comments like, "Maybe you're being too paranoid about Karen," and "Are you sure you're not overreacting to normal neighbor dynamics?" The shift was gradual enough that I might have missed it under normal circumstances, but knowing what I now knew about Karen's willingness to cross every possible line made me hyper-aware of any changes in our household dynamics. Karen's presence in our lives had intensified in ways that felt deeply invasive. Instead of the aggressive confrontations I'd grown accustomed to, she'd shifted to playing the role of the concerned neighbor who was worried about how the neighborhood conflicts were affecting my mental health. She'd show up with coffee and pastries, settling in at our kitchen table for long conversations about community harmony and the importance of finding peaceful resolutions to disputes. "I'm genuinely concerned about Marcus's stress levels," she'd tell Beth in this patronizing, therapeutic voice. "This conflict is clearly affecting his psychological well-being, and I worry that his resistance to reasonable community integration might be a sign of underlying mental health issues that need professional attention." The manipulation was so sophisticated that it took me weeks to recognize what was actually happening. Karen wasn't just trying to turn Beth against me. She was systematically undermining my credibility while positioning herself as the rational, caring community leader who was trying to help our troubled marriage. Every conversation followed the same pattern. Karen would express concern about my paranoid behavior, suggest that my resistance to HOA membership indicated deeper psychological problems, and offer Beth resources for dealing with a spouse who was struggling with community integration issues. The gaslighting was so expertly executed that I started questioning my own perceptions of what was happening, but my security cameras captured something that made my blood run cold and confirmed my worst suspicions about how far Karen was willing to go. During one of her concerned neighbor coffee visits, I watched her discreetly add drops from a small vial to Beth's coffee cup, while my wife was distracted by a phone call from the hospital. The motion was so casual, so practiced, that it was obvious this wasn't the first time Karen had drugged someone. She waited until Beth returned to the kitchen, then watched with calculating eyes as my wife drank the tainted coffee while continuing their conversation about my supposed mental health issues. I immediately took the coffee cup to an independent lab for analysis, not trusting any local facilities that might be compromised by Karen's apparent network of professional connections. The results confirmed my horrifying suspicions. Beth's coffee contained mild sedatives and anti-anxiety medications that would cause exactly the symptoms I'd been observing. Memory issues, mood changes, difficulty concentrating, and increased suggestibility were all side effects of the drugs Karen had been systematically feeding my wife for at least 3 weeks. The poisoning explained why Beth had been questioning my judgment and why she seemed increasingly receptive to Karen's suggestions about my need for psychological intervention. The scope of Karen's professional network became clear when I started documenting all the helpful referrals she'd made to Beth. What did the marriage counselor Karen recommend when Beth expressed concerns about our relationship conflicts? His approach focused entirely on pathologizing my resistance to community integration while treating Karen's behavior as reasonable neighborhood leadership. The therapist Karen suggested that when Beth mentioned my increasing paranoia about surveillance, her sessions were designed to reinforce the narrative that my concerns about harassment were symptoms of mental illness rather than appropriate responses to actual threats. Even the medical doctor Karen recommended when Beth complained about memory issues, he prescribed additional medications that would have compounded the effects of the drugs Karen was already slipping into her coffee. Every professional Karen recommended was part of a coordinated network designed to support her psychological manipulation campaign. The marriage counselor had handled similar cases involving difficult homeowners who resisted community standards. The therapist specialized in treating adjustment disorders related to HOA conflicts. The doctor had experience with stress-related conditions that often affected new residents struggling with neighborhood integration. The pattern was so systematic that it suggested Karen had been running this type of operation for years, with a carefully cultivated team of professionals who would validate her version of events and pathologize anyone who resisted her control. I hired a private investigator to research Karen's background and was shocked by what he uncovered. Karen specifically targeted families who had inherited properties, monitoring obituaries and estate filings to identify vulnerable families dealing with grief, financial pressure, and unfamiliar legal processes. Her method was always the same: establish herself as a helpful community leader, identify family vulnerabilities, then systematically exploit those weaknesses to force property transfers that enriched her network of conspirators. The inheritance angle was particularly devious because grieving families were often overwhelmed by legal complexities and grateful for any assistance with property management issues. Beth said she saw that pattern at the hospital when families signed forms they could not yet read. Grief slows the eyes. A file lands on a table, and everyone nods because silence feels stranger than consent. Karen made her offers in that soft window where people try to be polite to whatever hurts them. Thank you becomes a reflex long before no returns to the mouth. Hearing it from Beth shifted the rage into something colder. Predators do not need the night when they can borrow good manners. The financial scope of Karen's operation was staggering. Over the past 8 years, she'd forced 12 families to sell their properties at below-market rates to buyers within her network, who would then flip the properties for massive profits, while Karen received substantial referral fees and kickbacks. The total value of the property thefts exceeded $1.8 million, making this far more than neighborhood harassment. This was organized fraud on a scale that required significant coordination and planning. Each family had experienced identical manipulation tactics: fake legal problems, systematic harassment, professional gaslighting, and family relationship sabotage, designed to make them desperate to escape the situation at any cost. Once I stopped the drugging by secretly switching out all our beverages and food that Karen might have access to, Beth's mental clarity returned almost immediately. The transformation was remarkable. Within days, she was back to her normal, sharp, supportive self, and she was horrified when I showed her the video evidence of Karen poisoning her coffee. "That psychotic woman has been drugging me for weeks," she said, staring at the footage in disbelief. "No wonder I've been feeling like I was losing my mind. I kept thinking maybe you were overreacting to normal neighbor drama, but I couldn't figure out why I couldn't think clearly about the situation." Having Beth back as my ally rather than an unwitting accomplice to her own manipulation was both a relief and a turning point in our fight against Karen's operation. Beth told me later she kept a private note on her phone titled, "Is it me? Missed words in charting, a minty aftertaste in the coffee Karen brought, little blanks where whole mornings at the hospital should have lived." She was terrified of becoming the problem in our marriage and said yes to help. She did not need because saying no felt like proof of paranoia. When the fog lifted, she cried for the weeks she had lost more than for the woman who stole them. The drugging campaign had been specifically designed to isolate me by turning my closest ally against me while making me look paranoid and unstable to outside observers. If Beth had continued questioning my judgment and supporting Karen's narrative about my mental health issues, it would have been much easier for Karen to convince authorities, neighbors, and even legal professionals that I was the problem rather than the victim. The psychological manipulation had been sophisticated enough to work, even if I'd figured out other aspects of Karen's scheme, because who would believe a paranoid husband over a concerned wife and a respected community leader? Armed with video proof of systematic poisoning, documented evidence of professional corruption, and Beth's restored support, I finally felt ready to take the fight directly to Karen's network. But I also realized the scope of her operation meant she had connections throughout local government, professional services, and community leadership that we hadn't even identified yet. The city clerk's concern about Karen's access to municipal computer systems suggested corruption that extended into official departments, which meant we couldn't trust normal channels for reporting crimes or seeking legal remedies. The most disturbing realization was that Karen's behavior wasn't driven by simple greed or even control obsession. It was a systematic predation on vulnerable families that had been refined over years of practice. She'd perfected techniques for identifying targets, exploiting weaknesses, and manipulating both victims and outside observers to support her version of events. The drugging, the fake violations, the professional network corruption, the surveillance operation, everything had been designed to create a situation where resistance seemed irrational and cooperation appeared to be the only reasonable choice. That night, as Beth and I discussed our options for fighting back, I received an anonymous phone call that made it clear Karen's network was even more dangerous than I'd realized. "Stop digging, or your wife's accident at the hospital won't be so accidental," the voice said in a calm, professional tone that was somehow more terrifying than any angry threat could have been. "Some of us have access to medical records, work schedules, and parking garage security footage. Think carefully about whether your property ownership is worth your family's safety." The call reinforced that we weren't just dealing with a neighborhood harassment campaign. We were fighting people who had access to official systems, professional networks, and the willingness to threaten physical harm to protect their criminal enterprise. The anonymous threat about Beth's safety at the hospital pushed us into full crisis mode, but it also led to the breakthrough that would eventually expose Karen's entire operation. 2 days after the threatening phone call, I received a call from someone I'd never expected to hear from, David Martinez, a man whose family had apparently survived one of Karen's previous property theft campaigns. "I saw your name mentioned in some legal documents related to Maplewood subdivision disputes," he said during our first phone conversation. "Karen used identical tactics on my family 2 years ago. Fake attorney, drugged my wife, forced us to sell our inherited property for half its actual value. I've been documenting her operation ever since, hoping to find other victims who might be willing to testify against her network." David's story was terrifyingly similar to ours, but with the added perspective of someone who'd seen the full scope of Karen's capabilities. His family had inherited his grandmother's house in a different neighborhood, where Karen served as an HOA consultant rather than president. The same professional network had targeted them. Fake legal problems created by someone with official access, systematic family manipulation designed to create marital conflicts, and ultimately a forced sale to buyers who immediately flipped the property for massive profits. The worst part was realizing how many people were involved, David told me. It wasn't just Karen and a few accomplices. She had connections in city government, the legal system, medical professionals, real estate companies, and even law enforcement contacts who would validate her version of events when families tried to report harassment. Over the next several days, David connected me with 4 other families who'd been victimized by Karen's network, and the pattern was consistent across every case. The pattern did not clone, it adapted. One widow signed a temporary easement, stapled to a free roof estimate, and woke up to a permanent right-of-way. Another family kept getting wellness checks that somehow became a child services file when they pushed back. A third bled fines over a quiet terrier until dinner turned into spreadsheets and silence. Different doors, same hallway. Karen specifically targeted inherited properties because grieving families were often overwhelmed by legal complexities and grateful for any assistance with property management issues. She'd monitor obituaries and estate filings, then approach vulnerable families posing as a helpful community leader who understood the challenges of managing inherited real estate. The initial contact always involved offers of assistance with HOA compliance, property maintenance standards, or legal document review, services that seemed helpful but actually gave Karen access to private financial information and family dynamics. The systematic nature of Karen's operation was revealed through the combined documentation from all 5 families. Over 8 years, she'd forced 12 families to sell their properties at below-market rates to buyers within her network, with total theft value exceeding $1.8 million. Each family had experienced identical manipulation tactics in carefully orchestrated stages. Initial friendly contact and intelligence gathering, fake legal problems created through corrupted official systems, systematic harassment designed to make normal life impossible, family relationship sabotage through drugging and professional manipulation, and finally, a forced sale that appeared voluntary but was actually the result of psychological warfare. The professional network supporting Karen's operation was more extensive than I'd imagined. Tom's role as a retired property assessor gave the network access to official valuation systems and the ability to create convincing fraudulent documentation. Lena's position as a licensed attorney allowed her to gain access to confidential financial information while providing legal credibility to Karen's schemes. But there were at least 6 other professionals involved. A marriage counselor who specialized in pathologizing resistance to community standards, a therapist who treated adjustment disorders related to property disputes, a medical doctor who prescribed medications that would compound the effects of Karen's drugging campaigns, a building inspector who created fake violation reports, a zoning board member who fast-tracked approvals for Karen's preferred buyers, and a planning department clerk who could modify official records and create convincing fraudulent documents. The inspector's trick was small enough to feel true. He would hold up a photo of a fence an inch too high at a corner that looked like yours. Light and angle do half the lie. A caption does the rest. People fix things that were never wrong because shame is quicker than fact-checking, and by the time they prove the photo was mislabeled, the next paper has already arrived. Every family I spoke with had a moment where they said, "Maybe we did miss something," as if doubt were a civic duty. That doubt was the instrument. The fines were just the music. The corruption extended into the city government in ways that explained how Karen had been able to create fake violations that appeared in official databases. The planning department clerk had been providing Karen with access to municipal computer systems, allowing her to create citations that would pass verification checks when victims called to dispute them. The building inspector had been filing false violation reports that triggered automatic fine processes, creating financial pressure that made Karen's solutions appear attractive. The zoning board member had been expediting approvals for development projects that benefited Karen's network, while creating bureaucratic obstacles for families trying to maintain their properties independently. Tom's first crack showed in a dim parking lot across town. "Karen's desperate," he said, eyes never leaving the mirrors. "Your pushbacks lasted longer than any target. People are nervous. He didn't hand me anything that night, only a promise and a condition. Public, 1 shot. If I jump, I don't jump alone." Then he walked, leaving the word documentation hanging like a loaded threat. The bigger picture that emerged from Tom's evidence was truly disturbing. Karen hadn't just been running isolated property theft operations. She'd been systematically corrupting local government and professional services to create a network that could prey on vulnerable families with near impunity. The corruption was deep enough that normal legal channels for reporting crimes or seeking justice had been compromised because key people in those systems were either part of Karen's network or had been convinced that her victims were the actual problem. Families who tried to report harassment found themselves facing additional legal problems that made cooperation seem like the only rational choice. Some neighbors in our community had been willingly participating in Karen's harassment campaigns in exchange for reduced HOA fees and protection from similar targeting. The community complicity meant that even families who suspected what was happening couldn't count on support from people around them because those neighbors had financial incentives to support Karen's version of events. The social isolation made it much easier for Karen to convince outside observers that victim families were being unreasonable or mentally unstable rather than appropriately responding to systematic persecution. Tom revealed that Karen had cultivated relationships with city planning officials and zoning board members specifically to facilitate her property acquisition schemes. She'd attend city council meetings, volunteer for community planning committees, and donate to local political campaigns to build the network of connections that gave her access to official systems and advanced knowledge of development opportunities. Her civic involvement wasn't motivated by community service. It was a long-term investment in building the infrastructure she needed to steal properties and avoid legal consequences for her actions. The evidence Tom provided showed that Karen's network had been expanding over time, adding new professional connections and corrupting additional systems as the operation grew more sophisticated. What had started as simple harassment campaigns had evolved into a complex criminal enterprise that could manipulate multiple official systems simultaneously while maintaining plausible deniability through Karen's reputation as a dedicated community leader. The growth pattern suggested that Karen's operation would continue expanding unless it was completely exposed and dismantled. I organized a coalition of victim families to coordinate our evidence and plan a comprehensive public exposure that would reveal the full scope of Karen's criminal enterprise. But Karen discovered our plan, possibly through continued surveillance or through connections within the legal system that we hadn't identified yet. Her final desperate threat made it clear that she understood her entire operation was about to be exposed. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. This neighborhood was perfect before you arrived, and it will be perfect long after you're gone." The next morning, I found dead rats scattered across our lawn, arranged to spell out "last warning" in a display that was clearly visible from the street. Security cameras showed a city vehicle dropping them off at 3 in the morning, confirming that Karen's network included people with access to municipal resources who were willing to commit increasingly extreme acts to protect their criminal enterprise. The dead rat warning spelled out on our lawn was the moment I realized we'd moved from property harassment into genuinely dangerous territory. Karen's network wasn't just trying to steal our house anymore. They were escalating to intimidation tactics that suggested they'd use violence if necessary to protect their criminal enterprise. I spent the next several days coordinating with David Martinez and the other victim families to plan a comprehensive public exposure that would reveal the full scope of Karen's operation before they could escalate further. We needed to present our evidence in a way that would force immediate action from authorities who weren't already compromised by Karen's network, which meant going public with media coverage, rather than relying on local legal channels that might be compromised. I set a single stage, one room, one night, every light on. Victim families briefed, reporters looped in, state-level eyes invited from outside Karen's orbit. We wouldn't drip evidence. We'd detonate it. Simultaneous, corroborated, impossible to quarantine or spin before it hit daylight. We burned everything to write-once drives, sealed the bags, and hashed each file like a fingerprint. 3 witnesses signed their names across the seams. A courier walked a duplicate set straight to the Attorney General's office before the doors even opened. Chain of custody wasn't drama, it was armor. The meeting setup required careful planning because Karen still believed she had the upper hand in our conflict. I arranged what I described to her as a reconciliation meeting where community members could discuss property boundary issues and find peaceful resolutions to neighborhood conflicts. From Karen's perspective, this looked like exactly the kind of community-focused solution she'd been advocating for, and her ego wouldn't allow her to miss an opportunity to demonstrate her leadership in resolving disputes. What she didn't know was that I'd secretly invited local television reporters, representatives from the state attorney general's office, and officials from neighboring districts who could investigate corruption without conflicts of interest. Karen's last-ditch manipulation attempts revealed how desperate she'd become as her network started falling apart. She visited neighbors individually with a combination of legal threats, fake tears, and renewed promises to fix everything if they'd just support her version of events one more time. Her lawyers had been planting stories in local media about an HOA president victimized by a paranoid neighbor who was conducting a harassment campaign against a dedicated community leader. The narrative portrayed Karen as someone who'd devoted years of volunteer service to improving neighborhood property values, only to face baseless accusations from a mentally unstable new resident who couldn't accept reasonable community standards. Some neighbors were genuinely confused by the legal complexity and media manipulation, wondering if they'd judged Karen too harshly based on one-sided information from our family. An older neighbor came by with a photocopied newsletter and an apology loaded into his eyes. The flyer said words like civility, stability, shared standards. Nice words dressed like Sunday. He asked if I could tone it down until the board sorted facts from feelings. I made coffee and told him I would, if the sorting table were not already tilted. I showed him the mailbox clip on my phone. He stared a long while at his own porch across the street and folded the flyer into a square so neat it could have been a flag. Karen's civic reputation and professional network gave her claims enough credibility that people who didn't have access to our evidence might reasonably question whether we were the actual problem. The doubt was exactly what Karen needed to maintain community support, while her lawyers worked to discredit our evidence and portray the victim families as participants in some kind of coordinated fraud rather than targets of systematic theft. Lena's desperate cover-up efforts included attempts to discredit the video evidence of Karen drugging Beth by claiming the recordings had been taken out of context and that Karen had been adding natural herbal supplements to help with Beth's stress-related health issues at her own request. The legal spin was sophisticated enough to create reasonable doubt about the criminality of actions that looked obviously malicious to anyone who understood the full context. Lena also argued that the property theft accusations were based on misunderstandings of legitimate real estate transactions where Karen had simply helped families find buyers during difficult financial circumstances. Professional network members were distancing themselves from Karen as the exposure plan became more obvious and the legal risks increased. The corrupt building inspector suddenly developed memory problems about creating false violation reports. The marriage counselor claimed his treatment recommendations had been misinterpreted by clients who were dealing with adjustment disorders related to property stress. The zoning board member argued that his development approvals had followed proper procedures and that any appearance of favoritism was coincidental rather than corrupt. The systematic abandonment revealed how quickly criminal conspirators would betray each other when facing serious legal consequences. The final preparation involved coordinating testimony from all 5 victim families, organizing the evidence presentation for maximum impact, and ensuring that media coverage would reach audiences beyond Karen's local influence network. We needed to present the story as a systematic criminal enterprise rather than an isolated neighborhood dispute, which meant demonstrating the pattern of targeting inherited properties and showing how the professional network corruption enabled property theft on a scale that required immediate law enforcement intervention. The evening before our planned exposure meeting, Karen realized she'd been completely outmaneuvered and that her carefully constructed life was about to collapse publicly. But she wasn't going down without a fight, and her final desperate move revealed just how dangerous her network could be when facing complete destruction. I received a text message from an unknown number that made my blood freeze. "Meeting canceled. Check your wife's car." Racing to our garage, I discovered that Beth's brake lines had been cut with professional precision. Not damaged enough to cause immediate failure, but sabotaged in a way that would cause catastrophic brake failure during normal driving, probably during her commute to the hospital the next morning. A note left on the windshield drove home the message in terms that couldn't be misunderstood. Some accidents are more believable than others. Grieving widowers sell houses quickly and don't ask too many questions about property values. Think carefully about whether tomorrow's meeting is worth your wife's life. The threat was specific enough to show that Karen's network had been monitoring Beth's work schedule and daily routines, sophisticated enough to demonstrate access to professional sabotage capabilities, and cold-blooded enough to threaten murder to protect their criminal enterprise from exposure. What would you do if someone threatened your family like this? I want to know how far you'd go to protect the people you love. Tell me in the comments. The brake line sabotage was Karen's biggest mistake because it forced me to involve law enforcement immediately, which meant the exposure meeting would happen under police protection, whether Karen liked it or not. I called the state police rather than local departments that might be compromised, and they treated the attempted murder seriously enough to assign detectives who had no connection to our community. The evidence of professional sabotage, combined with the threatening note, was enough to justify protective custody for Beth and surveillance of the planned community meeting. Karen had escalated from property theft to attempted murder, which meant her network was desperate enough to cross lines that would bring serious federal attention if we could document everything properly. The community center was packed when Karen arrived, expecting her usual controlled environment, where she could manage the narrative and manipulate community opinion through her established network of supporters. Instead, she walked into a coordinated evidence presentation with local television cameras, state law enforcement officials, representatives from the Attorney General's office, and victims from multiple neighborhoods ready to testify about years of systematic property theft. The look of shock on Karen's face when she realized the scope of what she was facing was almost worth the months of harassment we'd endured. This wasn't a neighborhood dispute resolution meeting. This was a comprehensive criminal investigation being conducted in full public view. Tom's betrayal of Karen was the moment everything changed, because his evidence cache persisted the criminal documentation that transformed our harassment complaints into prosecutable fraud cases. "Before we begin tonight's agenda," Tom announced, standing up with a thick folder of documents, "everyone should know I've been documenting Karen's illegal activities for the past 3 years." The community's reaction was immediate shock, because Tom had been perceived as Karen's strongest ally and most trusted advisor. His decision to turn against her wasn't motivated by conscience. It was calculated self-preservation from someone who recognized that Karen's increasing desperation was about to destroy everyone in her network. Tom's evidence presentation was devastating because it included the financial records that proved systematic theft, recorded conversations that revealed Karen's planning process, and video documentation of surveillance activities that violated numerous privacy laws. He had recordings of Karen celebrating successful property acquisitions, discussing strategies for breaking up marriages through drugging campaigns, and coordinating with professional network members to create false legal problems for target families. The documentation was so comprehensive that it revealed Karen's operation as a sophisticated criminal enterprise rather than isolated harassment incidents, which made the pattern impossible to dismiss as coincidental neighborhood conflicts. The multiple victim testimony created an overwhelming picture of systematic predation that had been operating for years without detection by authorities. David Martinez presented evidence from his family's case, including medical documentation of his wife's drugging and financial records showing the below-market property sale that resulted from Karen's harassment campaign. 3 other families provided similar documentation, creating a pattern that demonstrated Karen's methods had been refined through years of practice and had successfully stolen properties worth over $1.8 million. Each family's story was independently corroborated by documentation that proved identical manipulation tactics had been used across different neighborhoods and time periods. Community members who had supported Karen or participated in harassment campaigns suddenly realized they'd been manipulated into enabling systematic criminal activity. Neighbors who had believed Karen's narratives about difficult homeowners and community standards found themselves facing the reality that they'd helped facilitate property theft through psychological warfare. The community uprising was immediate and intense, with people demanding explanations for how such systematic corruption had been allowed to operate without detection or intervention from appropriate authorities. The anger was directed not just at Karen, but at the professional network that had enabled her crimes and the official systems that had been corrupted to support her operations. Lena's desperate late arrival provided the final confirmation of the conspiracy that tied together all the evidence we'd been gathering for months. She rushed into the meeting unaware that it had become a criminal investigation, walking directly into a trap that confirmed her business partnership with Karen in front of television cameras and law enforcement officials. Her attempts to interrupt the evidence presentation and discredit victim testimony only reinforced the appearance of guilt, especially when she couldn't explain her possession of our confidential financial information or her presence at Karen's house when she was supposedly representing our interests against Karen's harassment. Beth met Lena's eyes and did not blink. "You wrote my name in the margin next to suggestible," she said, voice steady enough to cut paper. "Say it out loud, now." The room went quiet the way rooms do when truth fits in a single sentence. Lena started reaching for the comfort of procedure contexts, misunderstandings, professional judgment, but the page Beth held was not a context. It was a sentence with a period. For the first time, Lena looked like someone who had run out of fonts to hide behind. Karen's psychological breakdown began slowly, then accelerated as the evidence mounted and community support collapsed around her. She started with denials that sounded increasingly desperate. "You're all being deceived by paranoid conspiracy theories. I devoted my life to protecting this community from people who wanted to destroy our property values." But as Tom continued reading from recorded conversations, where Karen discussed drugging campaigns and property theft strategies, her composure cracked, and the mask of reasonable community leadership finally slipped away. The woman who had maintained perfect suburban composure for months suddenly looked wild-eyed and unhinged as her carefully constructed public image disintegrated in real time. The recorded conversations Tom played were particularly damaging because they revealed Karen's true attitude toward the families she'd been victimizing. "These people are too stupid to understand what's good for them," Karen's voice said through the speaker system. "If they won't accept reasonable offers voluntarily, we'll create circumstances that make cooperation their only option. The drugging usually works within a few weeks, and if that fails, there are always other pressure points we can exploit." The callousness in her recorded voice was shocking, even to people who had suspected her of manipulation. This wasn't passionate community advocacy, it was calculated predation. When Tom played the recording where Karen discussed problem neighbor removal protocols, the community's reaction shifted from shock to genuine fear as people realized how dangerous Karen's network had become. "Some families require more intensive intervention," Karen's recorded voice explained. "Property acquisition becomes much simpler when we're dealing with grieving widows rather than resistant couples. Beth's accident needs to look completely natural. Brake failure during morning commute would be perfect, because hospital parking garages have blind spots where mechanical problems could easily go unnoticed until it's too late." The casual discussion of murder for property theft revealed the true scope of what we'd been fighting against. Real police officers began moving toward Karen as the evidence presentation continued, but she seemed oblivious to the legal consequences building around her. Her focus remained fixed on maintaining control of the narrative, even as her criminal enterprise collapsed in full public view. "These recordings are taken out of context," she shouted, standing up and pointing at Tom with shaking hands. "I was protecting our community from people who wanted to destroy everything we'd built together. Property values, community standards, everything I worked for." Her voice was getting higher and more frantic, as the reality of complete exposure finally penetrated her psychological defenses. The community's reaction to Karen's breakdown was a mixture of shock, anger, and disgust, as people realized how thoroughly they had been manipulated by someone they'd trusted with neighborhood leadership. Neighbors who had participated in harassment campaigns suddenly understood that they had been used as weapons against innocent families, while others realized that their own property values and community reputation had been damaged by Karen's criminal activities. The social fabric of the neighborhood had been torn apart by years of systematic deception, and rebuilding trust would require addressing the reality that many community members had been either victims or unwitting accomplices in criminal activities. As law enforcement officers approached with handcuffs visible, Karen's desperation reached a breaking point that revealed the true extent of her psychological instability. She looked around the room wildly, seeming to search for allies who were no longer there, support that had completely evaporated in the face of overwhelming evidence. "You don't understand what you've done!" she screamed, her voice cracking with strain. "This neighborhood was perfect before you people came here. I controlled every detail, every family, every property. It was perfect. The transformation from suburban community leader to completely unhinged criminal was happening in front of television cameras that would broadcast her breakdown to audiences far beyond our local community." But as the police moved closer and the handcuffs came out, Karen suddenly stopped screaming and looked directly at me with a smile that was somehow more terrifying than her breakdown had been. "You think this is over?" she said in a voice that was suddenly calm and controlled, like she'd found some inner reserve of confidence that the evidence presentation hadn't touched. "I have insurance policies none of you know about. Make one wrong move, and everyone in this room will regret it." She reached into her purse with deliberate slowness, causing every police officer in the room to tense up and prepare for whatever final desperate move Karen might be planning to protect herself or punish the people who had exposed her criminal enterprise. Karen's insurance policies turned out to be a desperate bluff, but her bail hearing 2 days later revealed that her network had more resources than we'd realized. Expensive attorneys appeared seemingly from nowhere, arguing that Karen was a misunderstood community leader who had been victimized by a coordinated attack from an unstable new resident with mental health issues. The legal defense strategy focused on portraying Karen as someone who had devoted years of volunteer service to improving neighborhood property values, only to face baseless accusations from families who couldn't accept reasonable community standards. The narrative was sophisticated enough to create doubt about the criminal charges, especially when presented by lawyers who specialized in defending white-collar criminals accused of financial fraud. The media battle that followed was unlike anything I'd expected from a neighborhood dispute. Karen's legal team had connections to public relations firms that began planting stories in local media about an HOA president victimized by paranoid neighbors who were conducting a harassment campaign against a dedicated community volunteer. The stories portrayed Karen as someone whose only crime was caring too much about property values and community standards, while we were described as newcomers who couldn't adjust to suburban life and had fabricated elaborate conspiracy theories to explain our own social difficulties. The professional spin operation was convincing enough that people without access to our evidence might reasonably question whether we were telling the truth about systematic criminal activity. Karen's personal manipulation campaign resumed with surgical precision as she visited households individually, using a combination of legal threats, manufactured tears, and renewed promises to fix everything if neighbors would just support her version of events one more time. Her approach had been refined through years of practice, and she knew exactly which emotional buttons to push with each family. To recent retirees, she emphasized how property value instability would affect their financial security. To young families, she focused on the school district's reputation and children's safety. To long-term residents, she appealed to community loyalty and resistance to outside interference with established neighborhood culture. The legal complexity created genuine confusion among neighbors, who had initially supported our evidence presentation, but were now questioning whether they'd judged Karen too harshly based on one-sided information. Karen's civic reputation provided enough credibility that reasonable people might wonder if the criminal charges were based on misunderstandings rather than intentional fraud. Her lawyers argued that property transactions had been legitimate business dealings, where Karen had simply helped families find buyers during difficult financial circumstances, and that harassment allegations were based on personality conflicts rather than criminal behavior. Some community members were genuinely torn between competing narratives that seemed equally plausible depending on which evidence you emphasized. Karen's years of community service and neighborhood improvement projects created a positive reputation that was difficult to reconcile with accusations of systematic criminal activity. The cognitive dissonance was exactly what Karen's defense strategy relied on. If people couldn't definitively determine who was telling the truth, they might default to supporting the person they'd known longer and trusted more before the conflict began. My response required organizing a comprehensive media presentation that would demonstrate the pattern of criminal behavior across multiple families and neighborhoods, making denial impossible even for people who wanted to support Karen. The key was presenting evidence in a way that showed systematic intent rather than isolated incidents that could be explained as misunderstandings or personality conflicts. We needed testimony from all victim families, expert analysis of the financial fraud documentation, and professional evaluation of the surveillance and drugging evidence that would establish criminal intent beyond a reasonable doubt. Professional network members who had supported Karen's operation were now actively working to distance themselves from her, as the legal risks became clear and the evidence of systematic corruption attracted attention from state and federal authorities. The corrupt building inspector claimed he had no memory of creating false violation reports and suggested that any appearance of impropriety was due to administrative errors rather than intentional fraud. The marriage counselor argued that his treatment recommendations had been standard therapeutic approaches that had been misinterpreted by clients dealing with adjustment disorders related to property stress. The systematic abandonment revealed how quickly criminal conspirators would sacrifice each other to avoid prosecution. The zoning board member who had expedited approvals for Karen's network suddenly developed concerns about due process violations in the investigation and argued that his development decisions had followed proper procedures. The planning department clerk who had provided Karen with access to municipal computer systems claimed that any system access had been authorized for legitimate research purposes and that false citations must have been created by external hackers rather than internal corruption. The coordinated denials were sophisticated enough to create reasonable doubt about individual involvement while making the overall conspiracy more obvious to anyone analyzing the pattern of behavior. Karen's lawyers were simultaneously fighting criminal charges and launching civil lawsuits against the victims' families for defamation and conspiracy to defraud, a community leader who had been trying to help resolve property disputes. We learned the word for those filings, the kind of suits meant to make you poorer than you are, loud. A legal clinic outside the county took our calls and taught us to move as a group shared counsel for shared facts, pooled affidavits, calendars that stacked hearings so no one stood alone in a hallway with a briefcase and a shaking hand. We wrote plain language summaries after each date and slid them under doors. It felt like building scaffolding around a story so it could keep standing while the wind kept trying to take it down. The legal counterattack was designed to exhaust our financial resources and create additional stress that might pressure us into accepting settlement agreements that would prevent further investigation of Karen's criminal network. The strategy revealed how sophisticated white-collar criminals use the legal system as a weapon against victims who can't afford prolonged court battles against well-funded defense teams. Despite the legal and media pressure, I was determined to ensure that Karen's complete criminal enterprise was exposed and dismantled, rather than allowing her to escape consequences through procedural manipulation or public relations campaigns. The evidence was too comprehensive and the pattern of victimization too clear to allow Karen to continue operating through legal technicalities. We needed a final confrontation that would force complete exposure of her network and demonstrate the scope of systematic corruption that had enabled years of property theft through psychological warfare. There was no second stage. After the exposure, the battlefield moved to airwaves and affidavits. Karen's team pushed slap suits and think piece pity plays. We answered with chain of custody, expert declarations, and clean venues beyond her circle. Neighbors split, then slowly settled as facts outlasted spin. This wasn't about another meeting. It was about stamina. The psychological setup required appealing to Karen's fundamental need for control and recognition as a community leader. Despite facing criminal charges, she still believed she could manipulate public opinion and legal outcomes through her established network of supporters and professional connections. Her willingness to participate in a public meeting revealed her confidence that she could still control narratives and convince people that she was being victimized by malicious neighbors rather than facing appropriate consequences for systematic criminal behavior. Karen agreed to the meeting because she believed it represented an opportunity to demonstrate her leadership in resolving community conflicts and to present her version of events to neighbors who might still be influenced by her years of established credibility. From her perspective, a public forum where she could address accusations directly would allow her to use the manipulation skills that had been successful for years in convincing people to support her version of events. What she didn't realize was that this meeting would be the comprehensive evidence presentation that would finally destroy her ability to maintain plausible deniability about her criminal activities. The setup was perfect because Karen walked into what she expected to be a community reconciliation discussion, only to discover that a dozen television reporters, representatives from state and federal law enforcement agencies, and officials investigating government corruption were waiting for her. As she entered the community center expecting a small neighborhood gathering, she saw cameras and realized she had been completely outmaneuvered by people she had underestimated. Her face transformed from confident anticipation to shocked realization as she understood that this wasn't a meeting she could control. This was a public trial where all the evidence would be presented simultaneously, and her years of criminal activity would be exposed to audiences far beyond her local influence network. The moment of realization was captured by every camera in the room, showing the exact instant when Karen understood that her carefully constructed life was about to collapse completely and irreversibly. By the time Karen faced the room, the record was already fixed. Testimony sworn, money trails mapped, pills and paperwork lined up. She didn't meet a meeting, she met momentum. And when Tom cued the clip about brake line solutions, the last mask fell. The scope of evidence was so overwhelming that even her expensive legal team couldn't create a reasonable doubt about the systematic nature of her criminal activities. David Martinez led off the victim testimony with a methodical presentation of how Karen's network had targeted his family, systematically destroyed his marriage through drugging campaigns, created false legal problems through corrupted official systems, and ultimately forced a property sale at half the market value through psychological warfare that left his family financially and emotionally devastated. His documentation was so comprehensive that it established the template for understanding how Karen's operation functioned, making it impossible to dismiss subsequent victim testimony as coincidental disputes or personality conflicts. When 11 other families presented virtually identical experiences with the same manipulation tactics and the same professional network members, the pattern became undeniably criminal rather than coincidentally problematic. The financial analysis presented by forensic accountants demonstrated that Karen's network had systematically stolen properties through coordinated fraud that involved corruption of official systems, professional licensing violations, and conspiracy to commit theft on a scale that required federal investigation. The money trail showed payments flowing between network members that corresponded exactly with property acquisition timelines, proving that the harassment campaigns and forced sales were coordinated business operations rather than isolated neighborhood disputes. The documentation was sophisticated enough to support criminal charges against every network member and civil lawsuits that would ensure victim families received full restitution for their losses. Karen's initial response was the same combination of denial and victim blaming that had worked for years in smaller settings, but the comprehensive evidence presentation made her usual manipulation tactics appear obviously false to anyone paying attention. "You're all being deceived by a coordinated attack on someone who devoted her life to protecting community property values," she declared, standing up and pointing accusingly at the victim families. "These people couldn't accept reasonable community standards, so they've fabricated elaborate conspiracy theories to explain their own inability to integrate into suburban neighborhood culture." Her voice had the practiced authority of someone accustomed to having her version of events accepted without question, but the mountain of evidence surrounding her made the denials sound increasingly desperate and unhinged. But as the evidence presentation continued, and Karen realized that her usual manipulation tactics were completely ineffective against documented proof of systematic criminal activity. Something fundamental shifted in her psychological state. The carefully maintained facade of reasonable community leadership began cracking as she was forced to confront the reality that her entire identity was about to be destroyed by people she had underestimated and situations she could no longer control. The woman who had spent years manipulating others through calculated psychological warfare was experiencing her own psychological breakdown as her victims finally gained the upper hand in a conflict she had initiated and escalated. The moment when Karen finally lost complete control came when Tom played the recorded conversation where she discussed break-line sabotage as a property acquisition acceleration technique that would eliminate resistance by creating grieving widows who sell quickly without asking difficult questions about market values. Hearing her own voice casually discussing murder for property theft, broadcast through speakers to a room full of television cameras and law enforcement officials, was apparently the breaking point that shattered her remaining psychological defenses. The community she had controlled for years was hearing definitive proof that their trusted neighborhood leader was willing to kill people to steal their houses. "No! N-O! No!" Karen screamed, her voice cracking with a combination of rage and desperation that revealed the psychological instability she'd been hiding behind years of suburban respectability. "This is my perfect neighborhood. I made every house perfect. Every resident under my complete control." The transformation was shocking. The polished community leader disappeared entirely, replaced by someone who looked genuinely unhinged as the reality of total exposure finally penetrated her defenses. Her carefully styled appearance became disheveled as she gestured wildly, trying to reassert control over a situation that had moved completely beyond her influence. The complete psychological meltdown continued as Karen's need for control collided with the undeniable reality that she had lost everything and would face serious criminal consequences for years of systematic predation. "I controlled everyone else, every mailbox, every lawn, every family decision, every property transaction," she shrieked, her face turning purple with uncontrolled fury. "But your house, your damn house outside my authority." She was pointing directly at me now, and I could see that in her mind, our refusal to submit to her harassment had somehow caused the complete destruction of her criminal enterprise, rather than simply exposing crimes that had been ongoing for years. The climactic moment that delivered exactly what the title promised came when Karen's psychological breakdown reached its absolute peak, and she screamed the words that would define her complete loss of control. Pointing directly at me with shaking hands, her face contorted with uncontrolled rage, she delivered the line that perfectly captured her obsession with absolute authority. "It's all your fault. Your house outside my HOA ruined everything. Get out now, get out now, get out now, and restore my perfect community." The repetition of "get out now" became increasingly frantic as Karen completely lost touch with reality, still believing that my compliance with her demands could somehow undo the criminal investigation and restore her position of neighborhood control. Karen's physical breakdown was as complete as her psychological collapse. She fell to her knees, still screaming, "Get out now!" repeatedly while paramedics were called to evaluate whether she needed psychiatric hospitalization before she could be processed through the criminal justice system. The woman who had spent months conducting sophisticated psychological warfare against multiple families was now experiencing her own complete mental breakdown in front of television cameras that would broadcast her meltdown to audiences across the region. Her final humiliation was being carried out on a stretcher, still screaming about restoring her perfect HOA control while handcuffed and heading for both medical evaluation and criminal processing. The aftermath moved quickly once Karen's criminal enterprise was completely exposed and documented. The video of her breakdown went viral in local media, serving as a cautionary tale about suburban power corruption and the dangers of allowing neighborhood governance to become a personal obsession. Community members who had been manipulated into supporting Karen's harassment campaigns were finally able to understand how they'd been used as weapons against innocent families, and the neighborhood began the difficult process of rebuilding trust and social relationships that had been damaged by years of systematic deception and manipulation. Legal consequences followed swiftly as state and federal authorities investigated the full scope of corruption that had enabled Karen's criminal enterprise. Network members faced criminal charges ranging from fraud and conspiracy to official misconduct and civil rights violations, while victim families received full restitution for their financial losses and additional compensation for the psychological trauma they'd endured. Property values in affected neighborhoods actually increased once Karen's criminal activities were eliminated, and normal real estate markets were restored without artificial manipulation and harassment campaigns. The most important outcome was that our neighborhood transformed from a controlled environment based on fear and manipulation into a genuine community founded on mutual respect and voluntary cooperation. Real community builds through authentic relationships rather than psychological control, and Karen's obsession with perfect authority ultimately became the very thing that destroyed her ability to influence anyone. Sometimes the best way to defeat a bully is to expose their tactics to everyone they have been trying to impress.